Alrighty. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the American Watchman Roundtable. I am one of your hosts, Sam Whitfield, broadcasting live, joined with me this evening by my two co-hosts, Gabe and Josh, as usual. Tonight's first topic that we're going to discuss on the roundtable is the arrest of Roger Stone, which happened on Friday, hence why I titled this episode Mueller Tries to Stonewall Roger Stone. And just jumping into what happened, I guess Roger Stone was arrested by the FBI on Friday, taken out of his house in West Palm early Friday morning. What's What's interesting and what really caught my attention about this, though, in particular, was the fact that this is a guy who was arrested on not even any conspiracy charges, as far as I know. More like it was just more like election related stuff, and yet they brought in a full bodied SWAT team to basically raid his home with guns and everything. And there was this big show that was made about the arrest. And also, coincidentally, we've since found out that there was a CNN reporter who just happened to be in the area coincidentally at the time of Stone's arrest. So that's very suspicious to me. But in the meantime, I want to go ahead and open up the floor to either Joshua or Gabe and ask them, what's your thoughts on the arrest of Roger Stone?
I just want to give our viewers a bit of background information that I have kind of been following on this. So, as I understand it, the basic charge against him is that he was not colluding with the Russians, but that he was colluding with the people at WikiLeaks who had either hacked or at least gotten a hold of Hillary and the DNC's not Hillary's emails, the DNC's emails, and began releasing them. And the quote unquote smoking gun, if you will, in this is an email that he sent to another Trump campaign official who's not been identified by the investigation yet. Like they've identified, they know who they think it is, but they've not told the media yet, so we don't know. But the general consensus seems to be that it was probably Steve Bannon, according to what I've read. And so Stone sent this email to Bannon, or who we think is Bannon, who the media thinks it's probably Bannon, saying that WikiLeaks is going to be dropping a few more bombshells in a couple of weeks on a weekly basis. And the charge is that based on this email, that's proof that Stone knew that WikiLeaks had more and they were planning on releasing them on a time schedule and that he must have been in on it. And it doesn't really make sense because if you remember correctly, and maybe some of our listeners or you guys already remember, Julian Assange actually came out at the time and said he was going to keep on making weekly releases of the DNC emails until the election. And so it seems that Roger was merely reading the news and then told Bannon what he saw in a newspaper, and that's supposed to be the smoking gun. And that's what I know of it. But I just think that's some interesting background for our listeners because the charge is incredibly weak and has nothing to do with Russia to begin with. But then when you actually find out that it looked like Stone may have just been saying something he saw on the news, it becomes really quite troubling to think about why he was arrested this way.
Well, what strikes me, Josh, it's interesting that you bring that up. I was listening to the Dan Bongino podcast from Friday, and they were discussing Dan and his on-air partner slash sidekick slash whatever you want to call him. They were discussing how the timing of this is too it's too convenient to be just coincidence that this happened because I guess Mueller, as usual, hasn't really found anything substantial to try and tie Trump to any Russian collusion thing, and so he needed to produce results. And so, in my view, and in the view of several other pundits, this whole arrest was more or less for the cameras. Specifically, I want to go back to the fact that this CNN journalist just happened to be in the area when Mueller's FBI team arrested Stone. I also guess Stone has said that he's not going to testify against Donald Trump. His words were, "I am not going to bear false witness against the president." And I guess he made bail, and he's out right now on that. And as one of our friends from the AM First Coalition Facebook group posted, I guess Roger made like a video meme today where he said, "Oh, you've got me. Here's the proof," and it's just him with a bottle of Russian vodka. Uh, and at this point, I think that's as far as Stone's collusion with Russia goes.
Well, here's the thing, and this is something that I think I warned about way back when they first gave Mueller this job. And if you're on the right, you've probably heard over and over again how government bureaucrats can't be trusted because they're going to constantly try and grow their own office and grow their own department and grow their own budget and do anything they can to justify their job. And it's funny that conservatives never realize that this, if that is true, which I would say it generally is, it also applies to the military and it applies to things like this. And the problem with these special counsels is exactly like you said, Sam. Once the government has committed to spending taxpayer dollars, and quite a bit of them, in terms of this investigation anyway, they have to at least find something, or else they risk undercutting their own legitimacy, if you will. So what happens, and this has happened in almost every single one of these special counsels we've had from George Bush onwards. You appoint some guy who goes in there and he spends forever basically looking and looking and looking for anything to justify all the money they've spent on this. And it ultimately comes down to a very underwhelming case committed by a marginal official who may not have, who's not even within the president's inner circle. Stone's slightly different because of his relationship with Trump, but generally, and the thing is, even though he is a close advisor of Trump's, he's not held any post within the government, like in many of the other cases I'm thinking of. But they find some marginal official or whatever, charge him with something. He goes away for amount of time, 10 to 15 years usually, that seems almost comically, it's almost comical, because if a normal person were actually found guilty of any of these things, they'd be going away for a longer time. But like you
Yeah,
said, this is all for the cameras, so they give them a little cushy sentence of 10 to 15 years, and then about 5 or 6 years down the road, after a new president's come in and the media has kind of forgotten about this and the people have forgotten about it, they'll pardon them. And the member of the political class will strut out of his gilded cage and rejoin his peers. So that's the basic problem with these special counsels. A word on the CNN thing. The FBI has proven itself for about the last 2 or 3 years now to be either comically inept or disturbingly corrupt. It's certainly fallen quite a bit from the days of J. Edgar Hoover, and I don't have too much faith in them. I veer between questioning whether or not the leadership of the Federal Bureau of Investigation has become disturbingly partisan, or if they really are all just that bad at their jobs. Neither
well,
thought's really comforting.
Well, they're
well,
partisan.
yeah,
They're partisan bureaucrats.
yeah, they're partisan bureaucrats. They've also been corrupt for more than just the last 2 or 3 years. I recently read a story how, I guess, 25, 30 years ago, when the FBI was cracking down on organized crime and the mafia, there's a pretty famous boss of the Irish mafia by the name of Whitey Bulger. Some people in this audience will have probably heard of Whitey Bulger, but Whitey Bulger was like a big time gangster. But at one point, he got arrested by the FBI and was basically turned into an informant, and basically Bolger convinced the FBI to basically say, okay, well, I'll be your informant as long as you allow me to continue doing my stuff. So he ended up going to prison, but what happened was during his time in prison, he killed two of his fellow inmates in prison, and I think wounded like two more severely. But the FBI pretty much like swept it under the rug because he was giving them information, and I believe Bolger had like two more, rival gang members whacked or something on the outside, and he wasn't like brought up on any of that, and that was because the FBI swept under the rug just because they were getting information from him. So, I mean, FBI corruption is nothing new.
Well, I wouldn't. Well, I mean, I don't know the particulars of that. I think that's just a trade-off that you make to you choose you buy off a smaller fish and deal with the consequences to get a bigger fish. Maybe it is corruption. I don't know, but
yeah, I mean,
um,
it's
but,
certainly incompetence. They didn't even really slap him on the wrist, as far as I know.
well,
So,
true. I mean, they're probably. I mean, we're talking about back then. There probably is some corruption there. Um, the whole Roger Stone thing. It's interesting that there's no mention in the indictment of that collusion with Russia or even collusion with WikiLeaks is a crime, because that hasn't even been established yet. So this goes to like what Josh mentioned about before, which is how grand juries have to justify their existence. It's always something procedural or administrative in nature. Like you broke an administrative rule or you broke an ethics rule. It's never the big ticket kind of thing where there actually are charges and they're provable of like espionage or foreign corruption, because there is no law that says that foreign governments cannot be involved in our elections. That is never there. There's no law that bans that.
Let me rephrase what you, because you're right, but the way you phrased it kind of bothers me. I think what you're trying to say is there's no law that says foreign governments can't try and influence American public opinion or have lobbyists. There is a law that says you can't be an unregistered lobbyist, but that line has become really blurred, and I think that's kind of what you alluded to when you said espionage with the Maria Butina case, because
Right.
as far as I can tell, she was not an official lobbyist. She wasn't doing actual lobbying work, so she didn't need to be licensed. She was just doing the kind of, she wasn't dealing with the government. She was dealing with the NRA. So, do they need the license? That's, it gets kind of blurry.
the other thing I keep hearing, it's interesting that you bring up Maria Butina because Josh, because the one thing I keep hearing from the left and people against Trump is they keep saying, well, Trump has ties to Russia in business. Doesn't that isn't that even a little suspicious? And it's like, well, no, he was I mean, it amazes me that people keep bashing on Trump, and yet they keep forgetting that prior to him being president, he was like a multinational businessman. Of course, he had business dealings with Russia.
Well, here's what comes to mind to me for that. The concern is that there's a conflict of interest because the president used to was as you say, a multinational businessman who had financial dealings in many countries, including Russia. But here's sort of the flip side of that. One, I don't care who you are, even if you're not a businessman, you cannot tell me that every member of Congress and every president does not have significant financial dealings that go on in other countries, including sometimes Russia. And so, and I bet you could make a conflict of interest case against almost every president. But the thing is, you have to sort of recuse yourself from those business dealings. And as far as we know, Trump has done that. Second, if Trump really was, and you guys know this because I'm the one who wants us to be friendlier with Russia all the time. Our listeners know that. If and I've criticized Trump quite a bit for this. If there is an actual conflict of interest there, then why on earth has Trump been harder on Russia than not Trump per se, but the Trump administration? Why has the Trump administration been harder on Russia than almost any other presidential administration in our lifetimes? And why is Trump appointing hardliners to be our new ambassadors to Venezuela in the little kind of I don't really want to call it a conflict yet, but the kind of the situation going on there?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess that kind of segues into our other point with Venezuela, which I really don't know that much about. So,
as always, I can give you the foreign policy background, and then maybe I can ask you guys some questions for once. I normally do that. So basically, I'll give you the long and the short of it, kind of like I did on Ukraine a while back. So in Venezuela, as our listeners probably know, in 2013, Hugo Chavez died of a battle he had been having with cancer. And his vice president, Nicolas Maduro, took the helm. Maduro's only previous job, which I think is worth mentioning because it sort of gives you an idea of the competence of and I'm not saying normal people can't do jobs, but jumping from being a bus driver to vice president, no, he was a bus driver, foreign minister, vice president, and then president of the country. So that was his only previous political experience. He had been a bus driver and he was a rising member of the union. And so that was how he came to Chavez's attention. But anyways, Chavez dies, Maduro steps in. Venezuela under Chavez had been pushing through some pretty out there social spending. But for a while it was able to work because what Chavez basically said was, look, we have the largest oil reserves in the world. I'm going to nationalize all of our oil companies and we're going to pay for all of this with oil, which works for a little while until, of course, the oil market's not doing so hot. And then you realize that you don't really have much money. So the problem was essentially that he was using a finite source of wealth instead of creating wealth. And the thing is, in and of itself, that was a big mistake, but it doesn't really fully explain the problems Venezuela has, because as our viewers or listeners might also notice, Venezuela didn't really have the mass starvation and mass unrest going on in the streets until a few years after Chavez dies, which brings us back to Maduro, who, while Chavez was a socialist, Maduro is a flat-out hardline communist. He has openly compared himself to Joseph Stalin. He has made jokes about his hairstyle, his mustache, and his swept back kind of, I don't know what the term for the style of hair he wears is, but it looks like Stalin, and he's made comments to the effect of saying that's intentional. And he has nationalized far more than Chavez ever did. Well, Chavez nationalized the oil companies and a few energy sectors, and also did things in the line of universal health care. Maduro went out almost as soon as he became president and began saying, well, the oil markets aren't doing so well, which means we're not able to spend as much money to give people quite as many. They don't have as much money to spend anymore. So we're going to go ahead. We're going to nationalize everything, and we're going to implement price controls, and we're going to try and basically take total control of the economy in order to try and band-aid over the growing problems of not being able to fund everything with oil anymore. And so that's when you begin seeing the Soviet-style shortages where people go to the shopping market in Venezuela and there's no toilet paper and there's nothing to eat. And the so-called Maduro diet, as it's called down there, starts to kind of get going. And in spite of this, amazingly enough, Maduro has been able to maintain a certain popular amount of support. Even though the media in the U.S. portrays it as being almost all of the people against him, anybody who knows how government works knows you cannot have a 0% approval rating and stay in power for as long, with all the problems you have, as long as this man has. You have to have the support of a certain segment of the population, plus power structures like the military within the country. And so Maduro has been able to win elections, which were, they're not rigged, but and they're not exactly fair anymore like they were under Chavez. Under Maduro, there began to be a lot more. It was biased in his favor, if you will. Let's put it that way, without being flat out rigged. So, for example, all of the media was pro Maduro, because all the media has been nationalized down there. It's all state media, and things like that. And
And
so,
and it
the
wasn't
country
with
is kind
and
of
it and it wasn't with Chavez.
with Chavez, he did not nationalize everything. And so, for example, in the coup that happened against Hugo Chavez in 2005, if you flipped on a Venezuelan news station, there was about a 50-50 chance that you would see stations supporting the government, and then there were stations that were still privately owned and that did not want to support the government. And so the news coverage was overwhelmingly anti-Chavez in 2005. And in 2005, the military coup, Chavez was taken on a helicopter to a military base, and what ultimately saved him was, just like Erdogan in Turkey, his supporters came out in the street and basically said, "We won't recognize the new government." And after that, he started to get even more radical, but still nowhere near as far as Maduro. And so, anyways, back to my point. With Maduro, the country is it's deeply divided. And now the opposition party, which won the elections for parliament this last year, it's kind of funny. It's sort of the same situation we have in America, kind of, because the people elected Maduro to another term as president, but at the parliamentary level, the opposition managed to win a majority for the first time since Chavez was elected president way back in 1999, I believe. And so the new parliament has, after that, Maduro began trying to govern by executive order, which didn't go so well, and the government began to become even more dysfunctional. Which brings us to today, where the Speaker of the Parliament, whose name I'm going to butcher, but I think it's Guaido. It looks like Guido, but anyways, he has declared himself as the new president. Declared that Maduro doesn't have the authority to govern, and at least half of the population is with him, and understandably so, because they're starving and there's no food. And what food rations there still are, the PSUV, which is Maduro's party, only gives out to people who are still supporting the government. And it gets dicey because the military has come out and said that they're going to stand up for Maduro's government until his term is out, at least. And that brings with it the possibility, if tensions keep escalating and nobody reaches an agreement, it risks the possibility of a civil war, which I think would be disastrous for America. But now maybe you have questions, or I have questions. I don't know where we want to go from here.
Well, I keep hearing from neocons about, oh, we need to either intervene or we need to back the rebels against Maduro. Now I'm not saying that Maduro is a good leader. It kind of seems like he's kind of a bitch.
He's incompetent, and he got his job because at the time Chavez died, he was the most loyal person in Chavez's cabinet, and the way he came up just speaks to that fact, because you don't go from being a frickin' bus driver to being the head of a local party district to being the head of the union to being the foreign minister to being the vice president without being fanatically loyal, and that's what he was basically known for during Chavez's life. And so that's basically why he got his job.
It kind of seems like it would, it kind of seems funny though if that were the case, like if he were like a bus driver or something.
But that was his he boasted about it in his inauguration speech. I was a humble bus driver, and thanks to Chavez, I got all these government posts, and now I'm your new president. And when he was first elected, he was basically elected to be another term of Chavez. And then he quickly turned to full-on communism and has begun openly comparing himself to Stalin and doing things like that, which I've already sort of mentioned. But he's a far different character. For example, I'll put it to you this way. When Chavez was president of Venezuela, you could go into Caracas and you could get a McDonald's. You can't do that anymore. Not just because there's no food for the McDonald's to sell you, but because the McDonald's doesn't exist. It's been taken over by the state. And the reason Maduro kept on doing that is because people were reliant on all this social spending, all these poor people, because Venezuela the majority of people in Venezuela were poor before Chavez, poor during Chavez, and now poor during Maduro. The thing is, Chavez tried to use all this oil money to have this social spending programs, when it collapsed, they weren't able to give out quite as much money to people, which means that for ordinary people, they could afford less, for example. Which meant, in Maduro's mind, apparently, because he's far further to the left than Chavez ever was, that we need to nationalize everything and we need to implement price controls. Well, because, well, I can't give people enough money to go out and buy their groceries. I'll just take control of the grocery store and we'll lower the prices for groceries. And you can quickly see why that's going to become a problem. Oh, well, the farmers aren't willing to keep to sell us their produce for that amount of money. Well, take over the farm and then we can just have it and sell it at the price we want. So that's sort of how it domino effect into it. After Maduro became president, it quickly became a domino effect of the government taking over more and more and things failing at an ever increasing rate.
Kind of sounds like the Democrat Party if they had their way here. But I mean, all jokes and slights aside, it just does. It's still, no matter how bad Maduro may be, and believe me, he does seem like a piece of work. The neocon argument that we need to go in and somehow like back rebels or take out Maduro itself is that's a big no-no. Just because anytime we seem to intervene in these conflicts, we inevitably make things worse because we create a power vacuum.
Here's the thing, and if our listeners probably have already reached this conclusion, but communism does not work. And so if I understand that it's sad what the people of Venezuela are going through. I feel bad for them. But ultimately, it's not our government's job to improve their lives. And the thing is, as we're sort of starting to see, they have the power to improve their lives if they want. Communism is going to collapse there one way or the other. It might be bloody, but the thing is, if we start arming one side or the other, for example, I'll put it to you the way I think it would happen. Let's say that tomorrow, the government that we recognize, the transition government, decides that, well, we're going to use force to take Maduro down because he's not stepping down yet. And it's not come to that point. They're trying to negotiate, but I'm afraid if we keep pushing, it's going to come to that. But let's say they did. Let's say they took up arms. First off, where are all these people going to get their guns? They don't have any. There's gun control, hardline gun control in Venezuela. And two, the military in Venezuela, it's a Latin American country, but against unarmed people or people who are even moderately armed, it's still pretty powerful. They receive quite a bit of military support from Russia, China, and Iran. And so, and when I say support, I mean they're getting equipment and they're getting money and things like that. I'm not saying that Russia is going to intervene here like they did in Syria, because that wouldn't happen. But if it came to open conflict, the rebels don't stand a military chance. And if we were to intervene on their behalf, we could extend the war, but it's not going to lead to them winning the war, not unless we went out and flat out invaded the country on their behalf. And if you're arming and extending this conflict, it's just going to become a refugee crisis. There's going to be even more refugees pouring up towards our border. And some people are going to say, well, Josh, if they have a civil war, that's going to happen, even if we're not intervening, that's going to happen anyway. Yeah, it is, but it's not going to be happening for 4 or 5, 6 years on end if we back one side and it leads into a stalemate that neither side can seem to win. So it to me, there's no good justification to go in, because it just creates more problems. And also, to whose benefit is intervening and helping the new government take power? Because there's no real way that this benefits the average American. It's going to benefit a Texaco executive who is going to be able to get his hands on some Venezuelan oil they've not had access to for about 20 years now. But it's going to get them some new cheap labor to come and be maids at their house instead of American maids. But it's not going to benefit you or me one lick if we intervene.
Let me interject here, because I haven't heard anybody advocate military force before, and there are non-military actions that you can take. If we're already assuming these people are starving, then I don't know how much worse it can get for them in terms of us being involved in some form. I mean, because I haven't heard anybody honestly say that we're going to go in there with military force. There are non-military options that you can take. Whether it will improve the situation or prevent a civil war, I don't know if that will happen. But there also are just sometimes humanitarian concerns that have to be taken into account as well.
You can.
And I do agree that it won't necessarily make the average Joe's life better, but most Americans generally wouldn't want to see people starving to death under a dictator if there are certain actions that you can at least try that don't involve military force.
Well, I first would say Marco Rubio, even before we've gotten to this point in the crisis, he's been suggesting that we topple the government there for some time now. And he's the most vocal proponent of intervention now. But even in terms of, I think you'd have to define humanitarian aid, because I don't think many people would be opposed to sending food to them. Although as a general rule, I'm in favor of trying to reduce the amount of money we spend on foreign aid, because it's far too much. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't ever help people. I'm just saying we need to make sure that we're spending more money on our own people than we are on people in other countries. But going back to the point, I don't think anybody would be too concerned about food. But when we're coming to the kinds of aid that people are discussing sending, if it does come to a conflict, it's usually weapons and it's fuel and it's money to help fund the war. It's not so much food for the ordinary people. It's sort of the same kind of failed strategy we've seen them try in Libya and Syria.
Well, and I mean, not to be this guy, but in order to get the food to the actual people, a lot of these countries, you do actually need the military to go in there and help make sure that it gets to the people.
That's the problem in Africa. You can send crates of food to Nigeria or whatever, but usually what's going to happen is all of that's going to end up in the presidential palace, and it's like, oh, free food for me and for my soldiers, none for you guys.
Exactly.
It becomes a political tool, like what food there is in Venezuela. The PSUV, which is the ruling party under Maduro, has they've had a program for a while now. It was started under Chavez, and it was originally funded with oil, but you can apply if you're a party member now. It used to be everybody. But under Maduro, they've changed it to only members of the party, so only supporters of the government get them. But they'd give out I believe it's either once a week or once a month. And I think it may have used to have been weekly, but then they went to once a month as they began to run out of food, and so the boxes became slightly bigger. But they would give you free food basically, and it's been weaponized under Maduro for the last several years now, with the PSUV basically saying, "Well, if you're not a party member, you're not a supporter of the government, so we're not going to give you any food."
Indeed. Rick Garrett in the chat makes an interesting point. He says, I'd watch China during this whole thing. It's an opportunity they've been after for a long time. Rick, do you mean to take over Venezuela or intervene, or well, I'm kind of guessing that that's what you're talking about, but let us know. And yeah, I mean that kind of.
Can I ask, is this a question from a viewer of ours that's coming in?
Yeah, it's in the live chat. So he's saying I can clarify. But yeah, I mean, obviously, just to his point, real quick, kind of for just in general, we're not the only ones with interest in Venezuela. You know, I think certainly other countries could get in on this too.
Here's the thing. It's not about helping the people. When the U.S. government says that they want to change the government in Venezuela, it is to please large oil companies that donate to our politicians, because if Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, there are other countries that are problematic in Latin America. I believe Honduras is one of them right now, where the government has basically waged wars against their own people, but there's no oil to be had in Honduras, so nobody really cares. So it's not about helping the people, even though that's always the justification. At the end of the day, it's about getting access to the world's largest oil reserves.
Well, there also is the argument it is our sphere of influence, and they are in our backyard. So if they cause geopolitical instability, it does impact us one way or the other.
I do agree that I think that thanks to the Monroe Doctrine, I think it makes more sense to intervene in Venezuela than say in Syria. I just don't think it's necessarily a good idea to intervene in a way that would lead to an extension of a conflict, because I don't see anyone in our government being able to muster the political capital necessary to quickly end it by saying we're going to invade and we're going to install a new government. And I wouldn't support that anyway, because I don't think that we should be going around and picking and choosing governments for other people, especially when it puts American lives at risk to no apparent benefit for our own people.
Well,
But
go
my
ahead.
point
Sorry.
essentially being, I don't see that being the option. So when people talk about intervention and a possible civil conflict here, the way I see it is how I described it, where there's a civil war. One side, if nobody intervened, one side would probably be swiftly beaten, and we end up backing that side enough to keep them alive, but not enough to actually win the war, which means we're essentially extending a pointless conflict, which generates refugees that become a problem for us.
Right. Rick Garrett did clarify his what he was saying, and this is actually what I thought he was trying to make, because this was another point that I actually thought of as soon as he brought it up. He says, I would expect China to seize the opportunity as to securing resources by any means necessary, whether that is keeping the current regime in power or toppling it. Well, Rick, I just have to say, I understand that point. I'm not sure if geographically speaking, if it would be wise for China to do that, though, just because China is so far away from South America. I'm not saying that they couldn't do it. It is far for them to make that distance.
But
Did Gabe just say China under his breath?
Oh no, I didn't.
I thought somebody just went China.
No.
I think to what was the gentleman's name, Sam?
Rick Garrett.
So to Rick's kind of point, if China or any other European country tried to intervene here, then I would definitely say we should, because I do believe in the Monroe Doctrine, which is saying this is our sphere of influence, and we shouldn't allow them to come in and set up a no-fly zone or start sending troops to support Maduro or whatever. If that were the case, then yes, definitely I'd be saying deploy our forces, because that's a direct challenge in our sphere of influence. I discussed this the other night with my friends in Moscow, and we had a bit of a slight disagreement, because the conversation initially started with them kind of joking, how can America declare the president of, because we recognize this new gentleman who declared himself president as the new legitimate authority. They said, how can America appoint a president anywhere else in the world? And I kind of jokingly responded to them. I'm like, oh yes, well, we do it all the time in Latin America, because historically we have, and because it's our sphere of influence. And the point I was trying to make to them was, I understand that maybe you disagree, but you can't expect Washington to heed your complaints at all, because this is our backyard, just like Ukraine is your backyard. And so there needs to be mutual respect there. And then I also reiterated the point to them before that, whether or not America does anything, the Maduro government's days are numbered if they're going to continue doing business as usual, because communism doesn't work. You yourselves know that. You yourselves, the people I was talking to in Moscow, you yourselves have told me that. Even Putin has acknowledged communism doesn't work. So Maduro, whether or not, regardless of what any outside power thinks here, that government is not going to survive. If it does, it's going to end up being like North Korea. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll close with two thoughts. I would see China interfering only to cause us problems and distract us from what's going on in their backyard. And from that perspective, it might make sense for them just to distract us. But I will say that the second point is and this backs up your point, Josh, the Maduro government is not going to survive whether it comes into an open conflict or whether it gets resolved diplomatically, because it's the entire electoral process. I don't want to call it rigged, but it wasn't that he got 68% of the vote. When you have allegations of widespread voter fraud and you're buying people off with food, Because I don't know in what universe you could win 68% of the vote, you lose parliament. I don't know how that would feasibly happen. But his government is numbered one way or the other, whether the military turns on him or the public turns on him, just because he will find himself entirely isolated diplomatically, and at some point somebody will turn on him. I don't know exactly if the military in Venezuela is secular or who's in charge, but at some point I wouldn't be surprised if there was a military coup to remove him.
I'm actually,
and I can envision that happening pretty easily.
I'm actually in agreement with Gabe on this one because I have followed Venezuela for years. Way back when Chavez was still alive, I was following it, and ever since Chavez died, like within weeks of him dying, there was speculation about the possibility of a military coup. Because the other thing that needs to be factored in here is Chavez was a military officer. He was a member. He was a paratrooper colonel, I believe, and he actually did try to take out the government in a coup of his own back in the 1980s. It didn't work, and he went to prison, and that's how he rose to prominence and was able to come back in 1990 and win an election. So he had the respect of the military, if for no other reason than that he was one of them, and the military officers could generally agree that Chavez, even if he was making pretty big mistakes, that he did have the best interests of the Venezuelan country and people at heart. Maduro, you can't very well say that at this point because the man has, ever since he began losing ground in parliament, which was fairly early on, he has become, and also with the comments comparing himself to Stalin and just becoming more and more openly communist, he has basically made it clear that he's in it for the power and he's there to stay in office no matter what. And there has been speculation almost from within weeks of Chavez dying that there might be a military coup. I'm honestly surprised there hasn't been a military coup yet. I'm curious as to what the officer's reasoning is right now for backing his government thus far, especially when this seems to be the biggest challenge. I know in the statement the officers gave in their press conference the other day, they said they were doing it to defend Venezuela's sovereignty. So maybe they think that the event is outsider driven or something. But I am genuinely curious as to what their reasoning is, because I don't understand why they still stand with him either.
Yeah, well, one of our channel admins, this was a comment directed at me, says, you know me, Sammy, I'm definitely not opposed to the idea of a united American continent. Let's do this shit. Yeah, I mean, Jolly, personally, I believe I do like your sentiment. But the problem is I believe that's kind of what Bush 41 wanted to do with the whole, or no, excuse me, not Bush 41, Bush 43. I believe that's what he wanted to do with the whole thing, the proposed alliance between like the United States and Mexico with the whole Amero thing.
That kind of solves the problem in their eyes. I that'd be a hard pass, a hard no for me, but for people that are not opposed to open borders, then I can see that being George Bush's dream of saying, oh, well, I've solved illegal immigration by simply getting rid of the border.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess my only point in all this, I mean, I'm still reading up on what went on in Venezuela. You know, so I'm still looking into it more and more. But to me, the one narrative that I've kind of picked up on, I read a lot of the left's think pieces, just because I like to see what the enemy camp is saying. Somehow, Maduro's whole failed state right now is Trump's fault, along with everything else that the left loves to say. And that one is just utterly ridiculous to me.
I'll chime in kind of like this. So you guys who are my fellow hosts know this, but I like Rania Khalek. She's a left-leaning journalist, but she sometimes makes good points, and I kind of disagree with her on this. She had a good video out on the situation in Venezuela the other day. And she tried saying, and this is something that I completely disagree with her, even if she makes a few good points. So the basic argument was, well, socialism hasn't failed in Venezuela; it's been sabotaged, which, of course, is what they always say. But she's wrong, because no matter how you square it, it doesn't take an economic genius to realize that people don't have money, so I'm going to take over a restaurant, so I'm going to take over a farm, so I'm going to take over, and then you take over everything, and nobody's making anything anymore. It doesn't take a genius to realize that doesn't work. But she's correct in so much as that we have certainly made problems that are worse with sanctions. For example, you hear about Venezuelans not being able to have access to some medicine and drugs they need. And that is partly because of Maduro's policies of simply taking over practically everything. It's also partly because, though, we have imposed for years now very tough sanctions on Venezuela, just like we have on Iran. And part of that means denying them access to certain products, even if they were part of an aid package, for example, or even if those companies wanted to sell to the Venezuelan government or whatever. And so that has exasperated the situation. So we've not sabotaged that. We have and we haven't. I mean, we've not made things easier for them. We've made things tougher. But at the same time, you can't blame it all on that either, because it doesn't take an economic genius to realize that you cannot have the government run everything and expect it to have good results. Even in other even in other communist countries, they've come to that realization, except for in North Korea. And so it speaks to how incompetent Maduro is. The fact that he basically thinks I can come out and be Joseph Stalin and it'll work. So,
yeah,
even his boss didn't think that. Even Chavez, when he was alive, never went that far. So the fact Maduro tries to band-aid everything over and thinks it'll work, it doesn't. So I mean, yes, on sanctions, we shouldn't have put sanctions on them. I disagree with doing that. I'm generally opposed to sanctions because they don't actually help ordinary people there in those countries. They make life harder for them in the hopes that they will rise up and resist their government and blame their government for it. But in the end, many of those people realize that we're partially to blame, even if their government's also at fault. And it ends up giving them a worse opinion of us in the long run. So I would not have put sanctions on Venezuela, but I'm also not going to say that that's the only reason that the economy collapsed there, because it isn't.
And and just to clarify too, I think we can all safely say here, as hosts, that none of us were fans of Chavez by any means. He wasn't a great guy, but in comparison to Maduro, he was, I guess, less shitty.
I'm not saying he's a great guy. The problem I've had with it is when Chavez was still alive, they were already calling him a dictator and saying it was a dictatorship, even though it wasn't yet. Chavez won every election he participated in free and fairly. You can't really say the same about Maduro because, as I've mentioned multiple times, he began taking over literally everything and expanding the role and power of the state and becoming a dictator and governing more and more by decree. Chavez didn't. He had to constantly work either through referendum or through the parliament, which he had majorities in. Maduro does not. So the problem is, I am opposed to intervention in Venezuela, and I know that the portrayal of Chavez when he was alive was an attempt to justify it. The coup against him in 2005 was orchestrated in part by the CIA, and it didn't work because back then people didn't want to. Most of the people in Venezuela were still with the government. The situation hadn't collapsed as bad as it is, and some, such as myself, would argue that coup partially played a role in leading up to where we are today, because it pushed members of the PSUV, including Chavez. He never went as far as Maduro, but after the coup in 2005, he definitely went harder left and began trying to have the government take control of more things. So it's a complicated situation with people at fault on all sides, really. The only good thing I can say about Chavez is that he made some pretty good criticisms of American foreign policy. I'll put it that way. but I'm not a fan of his or anything like that at all. I'm vehemently opposed to socialism.
And with that being said, too, we still have plenty of issues here at home that we need to address, like the government shutdown, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, I think this is our third or fourth week on the podcast talking about this shutdown. Or geez, it feels like we've done a whole TV series on it. So, or something. But anyway, I guess the shutdown is out to come to a close, or why, I'm not really sure. But Gabe, it kind of sounded like you had some stuff on the shutdown. So what's your take on it, my friend?
Well, just background for our readers, but the shutdown did officially end on Friday for 3 weeks, as it were. And the events leading up to it were pretty much that it wasn't well reported at the time, but that Trump was unhappy with the shutdown. And that it was not, even so, it wasn't really so much Trump as it was Republicans were starting to really get antsy in terms of the consequences of the shutdown. And if reports are to be believed, it sort of came to a head for the White House when I believe it was a couple flights were grounded at an East Coast airport because they didn't actually have enough air traffic controllers to manage those flights. And the running joke for the shutdown has always, or at least from my perspective, what I've heard is that as soon as air traffic controllers pretty much walk off the job, or or planes can't take off because they don't have enough air traffic controllers, the shutdown will end. And it turned out to actually be the case. And it depends whether you consider it a loss or a win for Trump or a draw. There are some, like Ann Coulter, who have gone so far as to say that basically Trump is more of a wuss than HW. I would debate that. HW was pretty much a wuss, much more a wuss than I think Trump is. But in terms of the consequences, we'll have to see what happens. It is only 3 weeks. But the question will be in 3 weeks whether Republicans are going to be any more unified behind fighting over a wall than Democrats are. And right now, considering what has happened over the last few weeks, I would say I'm not too optimistic about it, because the one thing that's clear is Republicans are not united behind this idea, and they're not united behind kind of this American first agenda, whereas Democrats are united behind the idea of we don't like a wall and we don't want a wall. And you can say that Democrats supported it in the past, and they did, but fair is fair in politics, and until Republicans actually come up with a strategy or get behind Trump, there's not much. I don't see Trump winning another battle in 3 weeks if it comes down to give me money for the wall or the government shuts down again.
I think the president would agree with you, because I saw he tweeted earlier today that he actually had, he said there was I believe he phrased it, he thinks there's less than a 50-50 chance that there'll be a deal. So less than half a chance there'll be a deal out of the talks they're having right now.
Well,
and I guess to that point, I guess I would add, I think the comments about him being George H.W. Bush, read my lips, no new taxes, this being another episode like that, I think those comments are a bit premature, although I think the risk is very real, because if he does totally end up caving on it in 3 weeks, I think it would more or less be the end of him with his base. Because a lot of us, myself included, are upset about the shutdown coming to an end. I know my initial reaction to seeing him tweet earlier this evening was, well, why did you end the shutdown if you don't think there's a chance for there to be a deal? And I think the risk is real, but I think those comments are premature at the moment. We'll have to see what happens in 3 weeks. If there is no deal or consensus at the end of these 3 weeks, I think Trump needs to declare a national emergency and try building the wall that way. And the most likely outcome of that is that he's probably going to have that shot down in court. But at that point, at least he can say, look, I've played every card I had. I've tried everything I can possibly do. And here's what happened. The court shot it down, and that would galvanize, I think anyway, I think that would galvanize the right to basically go into 2020 saying we need to win this because we need to accomplish judicial reform and we need to accomplish it now. Because until we do, we can't do anything at all, it seems like. And that's not new with the wall. That's been something from almost day one with the travel ban, with everything. The courts step in and try and overrule the president.
Yeah, I would say the safer course for Trump is to do exactly what Josh suggested, which is, try and engage for 3 weeks. And if you don't win, do the emergency and then pivot to other issues. And like Josh said, if it doesn't work, then you can always just get your base galvanized by arguing that it's judges legislating from the bench, which has an additional advantage in terms of the one issue that most conservatives who were distrustful of Trump voted for him on were, and these are the voters that are not considered his base, was that he would appoint conservative judges to the court. So if you're looking for an issue that you can bring up in 2020 that might make some Republicans who are skittish of Trump vote for him again, this is the exact way to do it. I mean, as cynical as that sounds, is it sort of sticking it to Trump's base to a degree? Yes, but even Trump's base probably wants conservative judges that are not going to basically sell out the country for these high-minded notions of diversity and multiculturalism just for multiculturalism. So
I disagree with you, kind of. I don't think it's cynical or that it's selling out Trump's base because speaking as a member of that base, to me, the way I think of it, and this is why I say he should do it. If he's declared the emergency and it gets shot down in court, what else can he do at that point? I mean, we've tried everything. The system itself is blocking us. It's time to change the system and then do that. Now, if the Republican Party, if Trump got reelected and changed the judges, and then the Republican Party completely dropped the globalism, completely dropped the America First agenda, then that would be selling them out. But as I see it, it would be a first step in actually getting our agenda rammed through there.
Well, it also, I think one of the things that has gone unnoticed in this debate, because it's mostly been Trump versus congressional Democrats, is that the Republicans are not united behind this America First agenda, and it gets hidden behind the concept of, well, Republicans have voted in lockstep with Trump. Well, yes, that's technically true, but that's what most partisans do. They vote with their president. The thing is that Republicans didn't line up behind Trump in a way on this issue the way we saw, say, Democrats line up behind Obama with Obamacare or the climate change legislation. It died in the Senate. It didn't die in the House, but it points to a Republican Party that is still going through, this is your favorite word, Josh, realignment. And so that realignment has not completed itself. So there are holdouts within the party that pop up during debates like this, where you need every vote that you can get, and Republicans don't have every vote you can get. Democrats, meanwhile, have every vote they can get because they're completely united behind the concept of walls are bad.
This is slightly off topic, but it's still germane, and I just wanted to bring it up because I think it's kind of funny. But going back to Ann Coulter's George Bush comparison, if anything, the way it's sort of looking, and this ties into, the risk is real, but right now I think it's premature, especially when, if you look at the way it is right now, it looks like, if anything, the third-party independent spoiler will hurt Democrats more than us. Because I don't know if you guys have seen it, but the CEO of Starbucks came out this evening on Twitter and said, I'm interested in doing an independent centrist presidential run.
Yeah.
And Democrats freaked out. The Democratic consultants freaked out because that has the possibility to suck more voters away from them than it does the GOP. And going to my favorite word, I actually think that kind of candidacy might just help us a bit more in terms of realignment, because it would demonstrate that the suburban voters are going to this guy and he's sucking most of his support away from the Democrats. So it would be, I think it would be beneficial to the realignment, not just the realignment, but also helping us win the White House again.
Yeah, I did hear that Howard Schultz is his name, that he was thinking about mulling a bid. I don't think he'll honestly do it, but I do think it points to how decent a shot Trump actually has at getting reelected. The wall debate, government shutdown aside, because there are as we've discussed, there are multiple ways that this can be played where Trump doesn't come out as damaged as I think he's portrayed as.
Do you have any thoughts, Sam?
I would. Sorry, I was looking at something on a Discord real quick. I here's my whole thing with the shutdown at this point. Here's what I've asked people is other than the government employees, and even with the government employees, I would ask, how much has your lifestyle really changed because of this shutdown? Right? We keep hearing about government workers starving and whatnot. Yet supposedly, I was just looking at a whole bunch of, I wouldn't really even call them memes, although they were in that format. Basically, they were all showing examples of like all these restaurants and like private industry places, offering like discounts and food discounts for government workers. As I said last week, I really don't have sympathy. I have sympathy for like mailmen and government workers that actually do stuff, but like DMV people who just sit behind a desk, are bureaucrats anyway, and so
Well, I don't think the DMV office is closed down. That's a state level. That's they don't. I don't think the DMV people went out. I think maybe you're referring to people sitting at their desks up at the Hoover Building for the FBI.
Yeah. Well. Okay, yeah. So I have disdain for people at the state level too. Let's be honest. But also, like, bureaucrats. Basically, what I'm saying is, the whole narrative for why the shutdown is bad is because supposedly government workers are all starving, right? When clearly we've seen the free market kick in. And again, Josh, I know that you're not as much of a free market guy as perhaps I am, but this is an example of the free market kicking in ironically to help government workers. And so, my whole thing is, if the left wants to use these poor government workers as an example for why the shutdown is bad, then I think that's going to be hard. So
I'm just to clarify, I'm not so. Everybody portrays me and Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon as being against the free market, and I think I think you can say fairly that there's people falsely conflate capitalism with the free market. And that's partially because everybody's gotten used to calling it free market capitalism. But I discussed this one night where I said to people that Tucker Carlson, we were talking about something slightly different, but I said, and Gabe agreed with me, I think, that the system worked for years for most of the people until relatively recently after the 1980s as a result of globalization. And so you can't really say that the free market in 1950s America is the free market in 2019 America, because they are not the same thing. And what I would say I'm against is, because I'm for private property, I'm for you being able to run and open your own business. What I am not for, I want an ordered economy. I want there to be regulation to make sure that this system is working for everybody, not just for a wealthy top few at the top. And most people on the right should agree with that, because one, if we're putting America first, we view our country as a family, we view our fellow citizens as a family, and we take care of our family. And two, if you don't take care of your family, odds are they're going to get pretty desperate. And that's when you start seeing people like Hugo Chavez or Nicolas Maduro or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez start winning, because people are desperate. So
Yeah.
that's
Yes.
my whole shtick. I'm neither left nor right on that one. I'm like Father Coughlin in the 1930s. I'm against capitalism and I'm against socialism. I'm against them both. But that doesn't mean I'm against private property or against people being able to own a business either, because that's not accurate for my views. I'm more of a corporatist, you could kind of say, in the classical Catholic sense of the word.
So
That's a discussion for a whole nother time. I don't want to get us derailed onto that. Maybe we can do another episode on that one.
yeah,
But
I mean, I think for now it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens within the next 3 weeks, and then if the government shuts down again. I mean, here's the thing: going back to the whole government workers thing, I think they're going to get overpay time, right?
Exactly.
Because of this. So my point is despite all these sob stories that you've heard, they're not hurting as much as people might think. So
I think that kind of played a part in the way I see that affecting Trump's decision. Is I honestly think, and I know I haven't discussed him yet, but Jared Kushner has given President Trump terrible advice basically from day one of his presidency, because both he and Ivanka are internationalists, and they're both globalists. And Steve Bannon, part of the reason he was finally forced out was because he kept on challenging Kushner too much, and he's the president's son-in-law, so guess who he's going to side with? But from what I understand, in addition to Gabe's points earlier about the air traffic controllers, Kushner was basically pushing Trump hard to end the shutdown, because perhaps, just like with Syria, Ivanka saw some people crying on TV, and, well, we can't ever have that happening, so.
but Ivanka's also a millennial chick, and they get hypersensitive with seeing.
I don't think either of them should be in the White House. I think if Jared wants to be involved in this administration, the best thing he can do, because it seemed to be his original thing. He wanted to do foreign policy, so he could focus relentlessly on pursuing a Zionist agenda in the Middle East. But if he wants a role in the government, I will gladly send him to Jerusalem, and he can be the permanent ambassador to Israel, and we won't have to deal with him giving terrible advice on immigration or anything else in the Oval Office anymore.
That sounds pretty good to me. I mean, why Ivanka even had a job in the White House is beyond me. I remember during the Trump campaign, she said something like she didn't want a job in the administration at first, and of course that was back when during the primaries when people were interviewing the Trumps, and almost no one thought that Trump actually had like a good chance of winning back then.
It's kind of symbolically fitting, because the Trump family almost seems to have the same divisions that the Republican Party generally has, because Jared and Ivanka are more of the suburban kind of. I know Gabe doesn't like my bad mouthing them all the time, but they are from the more kind of suburban business kind of class of the party. And that's where their interests lie, and that's what they've kind of advocated for, and that's ultimately what we saw with the Bannon power struggle in the White House. Because if I recall correctly, I think one of the final straws was he basically used some pretty let's call it impolitely blunt language towards the president's daughter, and that was basically I think one of the kicking points at that point. And it's unfortunate because ever since then it seems like Trump's been getting terrible advice from his daughter and his son-in-law. And it would be much more beneficial, I think, if they went somewhere else and we brought Bannon back as an advisor because he's much more in tune. I think
Yeah,
Trump's instincts on the base, but
yeah. The presidency, and I'm not just saying this about Trump. I'm saying this about any president. But the presidency does not seem like one of those things where nepotism is necessarily a good idea. You know what? You know what I mean? It just
I'm not opposed to having your family in office. I'm opposed to having your family in office if they give you bad advice. And
well,
I'm sure you can just say, well, Josh, that's just because you disagree with them politically. And I'm not going to disagree with you on that. That kind of is the point. But when you get elected on one thing and then you have, because they are your family, advisors who are for something completely different, then that's where I sort of take issue.
well,
I'm a,
right.
I'm a
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Huey Long, and his brother Earl Long was constantly involved in his political machine, and they were generally in agreement with each other on the issues. So I have no
Well,
problem with your family being involved. I have a problem if you're giving bad advice and you shouldn't be there, or
well,
whatever.
right. Yeah. Exactly. With that in mind, gentlemen, I believe we've gone like a good hour and a half now. So, do we want to? I guess any more topics we want to cover, or should we wrap this up?
Mhm. I have nothing else on my plate in terms of discussion.
I I'm just gonna go ahead and say I think that Gabe's sitting down and eating something right now. But I don't know. It sounded like right before you said that, it sounded like a plate in the background, and I'm like, he's eating dinner while he's on the podcast. But,
No,
um,
that would be background noise, but it's not me.
but I don't really have anything either. Although I do want to say I think it's generally our podcast used to be pretty short, and they've gotten longer, and I think that speaks well of kind of how meaty our discussions have become. If I can add that.
Yeah, and I also think look, we used to have it. We used to have a channel of our own for these podcasts, and this is just kind of a behind the scenes comment on my part. I lost the password for our channel. So my channel, the Whitfields Report, has 115 subscribers. So I think on one of our first podcast we did, I accidentally streamed the AW podcast to the Whitfield Report channel, and actually we got a ton of views on that one. So I've been streaming and also uploading the audio file to the podcast version for the Whitfield Report, and I think that's actually working out. So yeah, to answer some of your questions, ladies and gentlemen, that you have been tweeting, yes, technically this is a secondary. This is a different podcast that we're doing. But both of these gentlemen have been on the Whitfield Report. You know, separately and together, just under that show name. So if it helps you guys, just think of this as the Whitfield Report Sunday edition. If you guys need that in your heads who are watching. But anyway, yeah, we covered 3 topics tonight, so I'm happy. So anyway, I guess that's it for this week, and we'll have to see what's in the news next week. I also feel real quick. I feel like some weeks we have a bunch to cover, and then other weeks I feel like it's so slow that we just repeat ourselves, like last week.
I kind of it happens, but I think the folks enjoy listening, so I don't know. I'll let you
Yeah.
guys. I'll let the listeners comment on that.
Yeah, we'll
If you
definitely
don't enjoy listening, then why are you here? I guess is my actual question.
do understand. We do our best.
But
we do our best, but even the best podcasts have slow weeks sometimes. So, but we'll also have to see how our download stats do on iTunes. But anyway, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Sam Whitfield signing off. Josh, Gabe, if you guys have any final sign off points, anything you want to promote, feel free to go ahead.
Other
put them
than we might be discussing the government shutdown in 3 weeks. Nope.
No, all I will say is that in terms of the Whitfield report, for those of you who were asking why didn't it do a podcast last night, it was because my guest canceled last night suddenly. All I will say is that for those who are curious, go out and check the Owen Benjamin porcelain documentary out on YouTube. I'll explain. Josh and Gabe, I'll explain what that is after we got off air. But anyway, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in, and as always, good night. God bless and God save this great nation.